Today we're going to be discussing some issues relating to ethical practices in rehabilitation counseling. First of all, the ethical standards that were developed several years ago have been revised, and at the end of this presentation there's the website address for the CRC ethics, and they have a link on their website to the new ethical principles, which are going to be coming into effect, I believe, in January of 2010. So for some of you, this will be in the future. For others, it will already be in place by the time you see this. Let me start off by kind of backtracking a little bit and talk about some issues that relate to being a profession. Because I think it's important that we look at the foundation, not just of ethics, but of rehabilitation counseling practice. And the first question I have is, what makes up a profession? And why are we professionals? Well, first of all, a profession is based upon a foundation of a body of knowledge, a foundation of community recognition, or allowance for us to practice, and that comes through such things as licensure and certifications. It also comes through in terms of having an area of expertise. So the body of knowledge leads to a recognition of an area of expertise, which then leads to community recognition, which you get through certification boards or through state licensure boards. And as part of that, you have academic training programs and professional areas of practice, and the limits, the boundaries, the expectations of that are based upon a code of professional ethics. So you put all this together, and you then have a professional area of expertise and a professional area of practice. And again, these would be based upon the body of knowledge, the community recognition for that body of knowledge, and from that flows licensure and certifications. You have academic training programs in which people develop and obtain that knowledge. That leads to a professional area of expertise and practice, and kind of subsuming all of this would be the boundaries, the limitations, the areas of our involvement are based upon a code of ethics. Now, as you see in this slide, it's essential and critical that rehabilitation professionals adhere to ethical standards and guidelines. The Code of Professional Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors is designed to achieve these goals, and as I said, this is being updated and will be in place in January 2010, the new ethical standards. There are 5 basic principles of ethical behavior, which I'm going to be talking about now. These are autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, justice, and fidelity. Now, these are all areas that all professionals will have and will define in one way or another. That whether it's psychologists or physicians or social workers or whether it's business practices, all areas of professional practice have these 5 basic principles or some version of these 5 basic principles. And these revolve around the sense of looking at the common good, not doing harm, having informed consent, and having respect and dignity. The professional ethics that we're going to be talking about have to do with our being objective, with having an integrity of practice, with having professional responsibilities, respecting the rights of others, concern for others, and being socially responsible. And we must, as a result of this, understand what our boundaries are, what our areas of expertise are, We need to avoid dual relationships. We need to avoid conflicts of interest. We need to be non-discriminatory and have respect for others and others' ethical or ethnic backgrounds and religious preferences. That we need to avoid any form of harassment. That is part of knowing our area of expertise and knowledge, that we make appropriate referrals to others who have expertise in an area where the consumer might be better served, and that we retain the sense of confidentiality of information. Now, let me just talk about some of these, and we can go from there with this, and of course you can bring this up in your discussion groups. First of all, the concept of autonomy, and I've kind of talked about some of this already, but autonomy is our ethical principle of informed choice for consumers, giving consumers information, and respecting people's ability to make decisions that are based on that informed choice. And part of this also gets into the sense of, well, what happens if we see that somebody is going to make a choice that is self-defeating? Well, that becomes an ethical dilemma to a certain extent, and it's up to us to present information as to the perspective as to why that might be self-defeating. Now, taking that a step further, it could be the situation where we learn that the consumer is going to do something that is beyond the boundaries of legality, in which case we are under a professional obligation to report that to appropriate authorities, just as if you find out that somebody is going to commit a crime, you are obligated to report that, or if there is some sort of abuse going on, you are obligated to report that. Now, you're also obligated before doing that to do everything possible that you can think of to determine whether indeed this is the case, whether there actually is some sort of abusive relationship going on, or whether there is some sort of criminal behavior going on. If there is, then we are obligated to report that. Now, that's not the more common type of situation that occurs, but those things do occur. A second principle, beneficence, is a positive one in the sense that it means do good. We are to help people, and of course, this sometimes backs up against different perspectives on what is helping people. Is having, for example, tough love helping people? Somebody might say, well, no, that's negative. That's destructive. If we say no to somebody, or if we have certain standards of behavior. So, as professionals, these are things that we have to look at in the larger context of the individual as to whether our doing good and the things that we are doing that we believe professionally will lead to doing good. So sometimes you get standards that that contradict each other, or you get approaches that somebody could interpret or perceive as not doing good. But anyway, the general concept, and again, I'm really talking general concepts here rather than specific examples, although certainly when the rubber meets the road, so to speak, you take the general kind of example of do good and you look at it in terms of a specific situation, and then you determine as to whether the concept and the general principle of doing good is consistent with the situation and how we are responding to that situation. Okay. Then you have the notion of autonomy, and well, I said autonomy. I'm sorry. You have the notion of non-malfeasance, which is doing the opposite, in a sense, of doing good, and that is the least harm. We don't want to be harmful to people. So these are kind of opposite sides of the same coin. Justice is in the sense of social justice, equality, fairness, equity for all people, and we want to make sure that we treat everybody equally and treat everybody fairly with the same approach and the same expectations, and that we devote full time to somebody when we are working with someone. And then fidelity basically means that we are consistent in our practice, we apply professional principles in our practice, and we fulfill the expectations of our role as professionals. Okay. Ethical standards relate to our counseling relationship. They relate to confidentiality of information. They relate to release of information to third parties. They relate to advocacy and accessibility of information. As I said, it relates to our professional responsibilities and our relationship with other professionals, and it also relates to being able to effectively use research and knowledge and information. Now, let me talk about some ethical dilemmas. And first of all, when we feel we're faced with an ethical dilemma, what do? We refer back to the Code of Ethics. We can seek advice from our supervisor, which we should do. We can get help from other rehabilitation professionals, but if we do so, and that other professional is not in our direct chain of command, or it is not part of the professional practice that we're in, we need to make sure that we're maintaining confidentiality. And again, keeping in mind the ethical principles of doing the least harm for a consumer. Let me just talk about some specific examples. For example, here's a question. You are a rehabilitation counselor working at a rehabilitation facility. One day, one of your clients comes and tells you that he is or she is planning to burn down his neighbor's house. As a counselor, what should you do and why? Well, my answer to this would be to clarify whether there is a plan to do this, whether he is serious about doing this, whether there is evidence that the person will do this, and to inform the consumer that we're going to have to report this to appropriate authorities because that would be an illegal action. And again, if you have questions about this, certainly raise it with your facilitators. They might even have a different perspective. Another question would be, you have worked with a consumer for several weeks and you feel that you are sexually attracted to this consumer. What should you do and why? Well, obviously the first step is recognizing that. The second step would be to see if it affects how you function with that person, if you do things differently with that person than you might do with another person, if you are able to function and focus within the boundaries of professional practice, then you could probably continue working with that individual. If you step beyond those boundaries, if you make advances to that person or suggest meeting that person after or work or in inappropriate locations after work, or say things or do things, then that is beyond the ethical boundaries, and then you should refer that person to another counselor. So it's a matter of fair and equitable treatment based on the ethical standards, and if not, then referring that person to someone else. Another question, your consumer has post-traumatic stress disorder and has had a number of panic attacks, which have cost her being able to maintain employment. Do you feel confident or competent to deal with this problem? And if not, what should you do? Well, again, look at your area of expertise. And again, in rehabilitation counseling, our area of expertise would focus on jobs, employment, functioning in employment, and adjustment to employment. we can address those issues in the context of personal and vocational adjustment. If the post-traumatic stress disorder is more generalized, which it probably is, but if it is, then referral to a mental health professional would be appropriate. So our area of expertise focuses in on helping the person within the context of being able to adapt and adjust to the work setting. And if it goes beyond that, then it would be necessary to refer the person elsewhere. I would say that in most cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, we will probably need to refer the person elsewhere. Another example or question, you are working with a high school student in a school-to-work transition program. On the way home from work, you notice a transaction in which the consumer appears to be buying illegal drugs. What are you ethically bound to do and why? Well, in that case, I'm not certain if we are bound to do anything because we don't know what we're actually observing. Somebody might say, yes, we are bound to report that. And perhaps the thing to do would be to ask the person the next day about what we observed. It's very possible the person will deny that. But the broader question becomes, at what point do we report somebody, or do we have an obligation to report somebody when we observe something beyond our own area of physical professional practice? This is the tough one because we don't know what we're actually seeing. This could be very harmless. It could be nothing. It could be people just hanging out on a street corner, and we don't know. We don't have that information. And it also goes to the fact of that we are not the police of individuals, that when people leave our facility, they leave our office, they go home and we don't, our obligation is not to determine what their personal practices are and what they do on their own time. So observing somebody, whether it's in a store or driving by or whatever, I personally am not certain that we would need to act on that directly. We may ask about it since we did observe it, and we might see the response that the person gave us, and if the response the person gave us is negative, then that may be all that we need to do in terms of doing anything. But it also may be something that will be raised with our supervisor. Now, another question would be that what happens if your supervisor, you work for an agency, and you find out that your supervisor is having difficulty with alcohol as a subordinate or drugs, as a subordinate, what should you do and why? Well, I think the first thing to do would be to make a determination whether this interferes with the person's functioning. And the second thing to do would be to talk with this person about what you have observed. Now, you might feel that being in a subordinate position, that's going to make it difficult, but it probably would be better to do it that way than to go above that person and talk with someone else. Of course, you could just ignore that behavior, but again, like some of the other questions we've talked about, if you see that if it's not interfering with functioning versus whether it is interfering, might be the difference in terms of how you act. So if somebody goes out to drink at lunch, has a drink, comes back, do you report that? Well, probably not, unless it's interfering with the person's functioning. You would observe to see if it is interfering, or you would observe to see if this is something that's happening on an ongoing basis. If it's a one-time thing, never happened before, you might just, let's say the person comes in inebriated, you might just figure out some way to have the person just go home and take the rest of the day off, because it's not a common thing. If it's a common event, then it might be necessary to have to deal with it more directly with the individual and or with that person's supervisor. I would always, in cases of conflicts with people, always try to go up the next level and not try to to skip the chain of command or the chain of communication. And I think it's important that that we not violate that, or at least we try not to unless it's absolutely necessary to do that. There are also other dilemmas that occur with release of information and informed consent for release of that information. There's issues about ethical issues about talking about consumers outside of let's say, a staffing. If you talk about a consumer in the elevator or in the hallway, there are questions about doing that and how that should be done. We also have ethical questions about who we would talk with about consumers and share information about consumers. There are also questions that arise ethically about how we report different things. If someone tells us that about certain behaviors or certain functioning about others, how do we respond to that? It's important that we, I believe, not rely on hearsay or innuendo, and that we rely on first-hand facts and first-hand information, and not on hearsay and gossip. So anyway, those are some questions that you might have. Another common question would be, what if you work with a consumer for a length of time that gets beyond what would normally be reasonable in terms of practice? At what point should you refer the consumer to somebody else? How long do you keep treating or working with somebody if they keep not showing up for appointments or meetings, and if they continue to do self-defeating types of activities? I think that we need to think through how we respond to those situations and how we handle those situations, and what is our reason for maintaining a consumer who is not making observable progress. And I think this may go back to our perceptions of the consumer, whether it's being sexually attracted to the consumer, or whether we are displaying some other bias, or favorably or not favorably towards one consumer, and don't do the same thing with another consumer with similar attributes. So anyway, ethical issues are dynamic. Ethical issues are things that the ethical standards don't always specifically address, and we have to look at how we interpret those. But I think within the general parameters of what we've been talking about, I believe that we would be able to function effectively. But again, as you talk with your facilitators, there is not always one right or wrong question or answer about ethics. Some other issues. Obviously, it's important that we provide services within our scope of practice, that we can only provide services, actions, and processes that are permitted within our knowledge base, ethical guidelines, and licensure or certifications. Okay, and here are two references going back to the Commission on Rehabilitation Council certification. And there's much readings to do about ethics, and ethics is something that's ongoing, and we are required to continually update our information about ethics.